with the times.
It's great to be here in Suva, and it is fantastic to be participating in the Pacific Island Forum. We have a very senior delegation here, myself with the Foreign Minister and with Minister Pat Conroy, and I look forward to listening over the next 2 days to the concerns that Pacific Island leaders have. I'll have a number of bilats today. First of all with Minister Fiame, the Prime Minister of Samoa, then with the President of the Federated States of Micronesia, David Panuelo, then with Prime Minister Sagavare, and then with Prime Minister Frank Bainimarama, our host at this conference, as well as then going to a dinner hosted by Mr. Henry Puna, the PIF Secretary General. We have some real challenges in this region. There's no challenge more important than climate change, and the new Australian government, of course, has adopted our nationally determined contribution of 43% by 2030, but we also have engagement with the region, including increased funding and support for climate change infrastructure, being a part of as well protecting fisheries here in the region. In addition to that, our considerable increase in development assistance that we will have. We want to have more cooperation and engagement between parliamentarians in the region and the Australian Parliament to build those people-to-people relations. We also want, of course, to expand the engagement with Pacific Labour in our own country. Whether that be a permanent migration, a specific program for the first time aimed at the Pacific, or whether it be temporary labour as well. This can be an important way in which we not only have people-to-people relations, but we benefit both the economies of Australia and the countries of origin of people either visiting or permanently migrating to Australia. We live in a period whereby we have strategic competition in this region as well, and that's part of the backdrop of this conference. Australia looks forward to engaging in a positive and constructive way. We respect the sovereignty of nations in the Pacific. We want to engage with them in a respectful way going forward. Our support for this region does not come with strings attached. It comes because we understand that we have a responsibility as an advanced economy in the region to provide support to our Pacific Island neighbours, and that indeed that is in Australia's interest very much so for that to occur. I'd ask Penny to make some comments and then we'll take questions.
Oh, look, I won't take up too much of your time before you get to questions. It's been a really valuable couple of days representing Australia at this forum. We are proud members of the Pacific Island Forum. We deeply value our seat at the table. The forum is the heart of Pacific regionalism and the heart of the Pacific family, and the Australian government takes our role and our responsibility seriously, and we value the opportunity to listen to and have dialogue with Pacific leaders. I'm going to be leaving later today, and obviously the Prime Minister leads the delegation now that he's here. I just wanted to express my thanks to Fiji and to Prime Minister Bainimarama for an excellent forum to date, and for his personal leadership in the region, and also to Secretary General Puna. Thank you.
Prime Minister, will you seek an in-person assurance from Manasseh Sogavare this afternoon that there won't be a permanent military presence, and will you raise any concerns about the security deal they have signed with China?
Well, I'll have a respectful discussion with the Prime Minister. We've already had a discussion by phone, and we know, of course, that Minister Wong, our Foreign Minister, has already had discussions on a personal basis. Our view about those issues, we've made very clear. We'd be concerned about any permanent presence there in the Solomons, and so close, of course, to Australia, and we don't think that is in the interests of the region. But we will have very much a respectful discussion We respect the sovereignty of nations in the Pacific, and I'll be listening as well to what Prime Minister Sogavare has to say. Just here.
Thanks, Peter. On Vice President Harris's announcement this morning about an increased US diplomatic presence, can I get your reaction to that? And one of the things she said in her address to the conference was that America hadn't paid enough attention to the Pacific in recent years. Is that a critique that could be made of Australia in recent years?
It's a critique, I believe, that you might have heard myself and the Foreign Minister make, as well as President Biden. We quite clearly said that we had a Pacific step up. I described what occurred earlier this year as a Pacific stuff up, that we hadn't paid enough attention, and I know that the Biden administration has said that as well. I very much welcome the increased engagement of the United States in the region. It's a significant support package that they've announced, increased diplomatic presence, increased support in the form of aid, increased support in the form of infrastructure development here. And it's consistent as well with the decisions that we made at the Quad Leaders Summit in Tokyo just a short time ago. When we met in Tokyo, the leaders of the United States, Australia, Japan and India, of course, launched an economic presence in the region, and that is very important. The United States is an important partner of the region, and Australia welcomes their renewed commitment. John, and then we'll go.
A similar question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Is America's step up here in the Pacific a consequence of Scott Morrison and Donald Trump's failure?
Look, I'm not a commentator. I'll leave it up to commentators to remark on that. What I would say is that we very much welcome the Biden administration's increased presence in the region, just as the new Australian government have made a considerable effort. The Foreign Minister has been throughout this region, I think 3-4 times, can't remember, a lot.
I'll come back.
Throughout this region on a personal basis. Personal relations between leaders are really important, and the Pacific Way, as it's called as well, is one in which you sit and you listen to each other and you engage on that personal level, and that is very important. That's why my presence here as the Prime Minister, I made comments during the election campaign that I was quite frankly stunned that in spite of the briefings and the foreshadowing of events in the region, all we saw was the former Senator Zed Seselja make a visit far too late. We didn't have that presence at prime ministerial or ministerial level, and I think that was an error of judgment on Australia's behalf at the time. What we're about though is looking forward and developing these positive relationships, and I've had a number of discussions with Pacific leaders. I look forward to developing those relationships on a personal basis going forward.
Prime Minister,
just behind.
Prime Minister,
Yeah.
what message does it send to China about the recent US commitment made by Kamala Harris this morning, considering that the US is Australia's closest ally?
Well, the message is very clear that the United States has a presence in the Pacific and has for a long period of time. They, of course, go into the Pacific in terms of their coastline, but also, of course, the state of Hawaii. And the presence of the US in the region is very important, and we welcome the increased engagement.
Prime Minister Conroy says Australia is open to partnering with China on infrastructure projects in the Pacific. What's your view on that?
Well, can I just let's talk about what we want to do, and the first point I'd make is we, as a general principle, we have said we're open to collaboration with all partners, provided they meet certain principles that, and you would know them. They are transparency. They are that the projects reflect Pacific priorities. They are quality, and I think you've used me here. You heard me use the phrase "no strings attached." That's the approach Australia takes. Obviously, we have collaborated through multilateral forums, health measures, but there's nothing in contemplation on the infrastructure front at this time.
Prime Minister.
Just here.
Prime Minister, is there any pressure on Australia to rejoin the Green Climate Fund, and what is your government's position on that?
Look, we have a set of policies announced during the election, as you would be aware, in relation to climate, not only domestically but also internationally. On the issue of the Green Climate Fund, I think Minister Bowen will work through that with me. We haven't made a final decision on that.
Just here and then here.
Prime Minister Sogavare has said some pretty strong and pretty negative things about the relationship with Australia, including that it is soured. How would you characterise Australia's relationship with Solomon Islands, and what can be done and said to repair it?
I think it is historically an important relationship, and it'll be even better after this afternoon.
Prime Minister, can I just clarify? You said you would have respectful discussions with Prime Minister Sogavare. Can I just clarify, does that mean you will be directly raising Australia's concerns about the security agreement between Honiara and Beijing with him in the meeting this afternoon, and what will you tell other Pacific Island leaders about that agreement and what it means?
Look, I'll have, I mean what I say. I'll have respectful positions that will put forward Australia's own position, including on that agreement. Our position has been outlined consistently, and when I meet with international leaders, what I'll do is treat them with respect. What do I mean by that? It means that I'll be honest with them, I'll develop a relationship of trust with them, and that means not necessarily agreeing with each other the whole time, but it means being able to have an open dialogue.
Prime Minister, can I ask
Here and then there.
Prime Minister, Shiva first.
Shiva first, yeah. I'm doing an AA thing. You mightn't have noticed yet over a series of press conferences, but you'll notice eventually.
It's obviously significant that the US was able to secure that speaking spot. How much of a role did Australia play, and how do you expect China to react?
I give Prime Minister Bainimarama is the host of this conference, and I give him credit for ensuring that the Vice President of the United States, a very significant figure, has been able to address this conference. That's something that Australia supports.
Prime Minister, just on Kiribati, opposition figures, or one opposition figure has alleged that China may have been a driver behind its decision to leave the forum. What's the Australian government's assessment of the drivers here? Do you see any sort of role from China, or is it primarily about tensions both within Kiribati and within Micronesia and the broader forum?
Well, we know that there have been issues with the Pacific Island Forum and its structure. It hasn't met for 3 years due to COVID. But we also know that the Prime Minister, Bainimarama, has done a remarkable job getting together the Suva agreement to try to ensure that the nations of Micronesia are able to fully participate in the forum. What I want to do and what I bring to this forum is positive energy, and I'll be doing all that I can to bring all of the nations who are members of the Pacific Island Forum together. That's what I want to see, and that's what I think quite clearly our host, the Fijian Prime Minister, wants to see as well. Yes, sure.
In the area of development to the Pacific, there's been some prevalent opinion and some from think tanks supported by the Australian government that speaks to a need for a change of philosophy in the way your government engages with Pacific communities. There's been criticism that previous Australian governments were transactional in the nature of the way they worked with the Pacific. How is your government going to, as you say, work with respect and work in a meaningful way to ensure a change in the way you engage with the Pacific and in the way the Pacific perceives your engagement?
Thanks for the question, and it's an important one. It goes to the heart of the way that countries deal with each other. And I've spoken today about the Pacific Way, and I've spoken about treating countries with respect. What that means is not just talking, but listening. We have, as human beings, 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, because we should use the ears twice as much as we use our mouth. If you do that, you'll learn from each other. So we want to listen to what the priorities are of the Pacific from the Pacific. That's what we want to hear from these nation states. We want to provide assistance based upon their needs going forward, and that assistance shouldn't be a matter of transactional arrangements. I've said very clearly what it should be is one of support as the end in itself, because it's the right thing to do, and Australia has a responsibility to support our Pacific Island friends. So that is the way that I deal with people in general. It's one of the characteristics I hope I have that's made me here as the Australian Prime Minister, having this great honour. And I'll bring that way of operating to this forum, and I look forward to listening in the discussions I have this afternoon. Just to yep. Yeah.
Vanuatu's priority at this summit is to see an advisory opinion at the International Court of Justice supported by the leaders. Would you like to see that endorsed by the leaders at the summit, and would you like to see it progress to the UN General Assembly?
Look, we're supportive of the broad concept. Of course, we haven't seen the details of what a proposed reference might be, so it's hard for any nation to just sign off sight unseen. But with regard to the general principle, we understand that it's a reasonable principle being put forward.
Prime Minister, at the election campaign you indicated a preference for migration to be permanent, not temporary. You've started to walk that walk with New Zealand in your announcement last week, something that's been very popular in New Zealand amongst Australians, New Zealanders in Australia.
Yeah.
Is the time right to consider that on a broader Pacific level and do the right thing by the Pacific family?
We have it with the Pacific. We announced during the election campaign a specific Pacific Islander migration program on a permanent basis, the first one that Australia has ever had. I think with the announcement that we made, or the discussions that we had with our New Zealand brothers and sisters, it was well received, because the idea that people should just be temporary migrants for a long period of time is something that is, in my view, not in the interests of individuals, but it's also not in the interests of our nation. I want people in Australia to have that sense of ownership and belonging. I want them to be citizens. I want them to be able to participate in all forms of Australian life. Australia, with the exception, the notable exception, of our First Nations people who've been there for 65,000 years, a source of great pride, are a nation of migrants, or sons and daughters or descendants of migrants in one form or another. We're standing here today with a Prime Minister with the name Albanese and a Senate leader with the name of Wong. That's the nature of modern Australia, and we should, where possible, ensure that those paths to permanent migration are available where appropriate, and that's why we have that specific policy for Pacific Islanders.
Do you anticipate China would make some sort of Pacific announcement to counter the US's announcement from this morning? And do you think this power struggle is overtaking climate change as the dominant issue here at PIF?
No, I'm responsible for Australia's foreign policy. I'll leave other countries to run theirs. But the dominant issue in the discussions I had with Pacific leaders in the lead up to the PIF was overwhelmingly climate change. And one of the things that has occurred is that Australia's position, just like it's been welcomed in North America, Europe and Asia, has been very much welcomed in the Pacific. Our changed position when it comes to climate change, and I look forward to having those discussions. See the last one.
Will Australia urge Fiji to commit back to the University of the South Pacific?
I think you asked me this last time I was here. No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't you. I'm pretty sure somebody did. Look, we would like that work through within the region. We understand there are strong differences of views between parties. We would simply say this is a matter in which consensus ought be reached, and given the number of, and we heard this morning I think and yesterday, how many young people enter the labour market each year across the Pacific, it is imperative that we invest in their skills. So we would hope that we can find a way through on this.
Sorry, one more just here from a local.
Announcements were made for specifically the scheme FMs to be allowed to be going with the WOCA. So how would this work?
Sure.
When
Yeah.
would this
So
be implemented?
the Prime Minister, there were three categories of announcement with the Pacific Labour or Pacific Movement. The first is the one the Prime Minister spoke about, which is a category of permanent migration. The second was that we would focus the labour movement schemes on the Pacific, not on Southeast Asia. And the third is the one you identify, which is we listened to workers who had come and representatives from those nations whose citizens come to Australia to work about the scheme and how it was working, including problems under the previous government that we need to resolve. But one of the issues consistently raised was on the longer term visa, people found it very hard to be without their family, which is understandable up to 4 years. We're still working through how that will work, and obviously Fiji is very keen to get those issues resolved and dealt with, and to have that rolled out, as are a number of other Pacific nations, and we will do that with each nation bilaterally.